So in this sibling stage, leadership is really about building that accountability, and most importantly, as we've talked about already a little bit, clearly communicating those ideas. So David just talked about some of the key questions that need to be answered when you're transitioning into the sibling stage in regards to what the business needs and how to determine roles. So, but how do we start to answer those questions? Where do we get started? So in terms of what the business needs and what the responsibilities are, a good place to get started here is to have the current leader start making a job or a task list for their day-to-day duties. Track what decisions he or she is making that somebody else is going to have to take on as that leader begins to transition out. They should also have some idea of how long they want to keep doing those tasks, knowing that forever isn't actually an option, that they will transition at some point. So here's where a transition timeline can be helpful. Now, this isn't a high-level succession plan or a company plan. It gets very role specific. So the duty, the job, or the decision is noted with the time frame that the current leader expects or wants to keep participating. Then who will take that on and when? And be sure you leave some time for some overlap so that first the next leader has a chance to observe of how things are in the present, how decisions are being made. Then the current and the next leader can kind of co-team and make some decisions together before the next leader kind of steps up with some guidance before eventually taking that over.
Yeah.
So then in terms of managing expectations, David mentioned the importance of very clear, very explicit expectations. The key point to remember with leadership succession is to clearly communicate those. More transitions fail going into the sibling phase because of poor communication and a lack of trust, rather than the next gen not being prepared. It's all about communication and miscues. And kind of like we talked about before, you've got this history, so it's easy going into the sibling phase to assume you know what is expected of you and assume that others know what your expectations are of them, when that's probably not the case. So this communication could be rather informal, or it could be a little bit more structured and formal through family meetings or even a family employment policy.
You know, Nicole, one of the biggest challenges that I've seen in the sibling dynamic is when you're going from a first generation, usually a sole practitioner, down into multiple siblings across, is kind of who is the ultimate leader. And you know, I always joke that you can't fit 3 butts in 1 leather seat. And so it's like who ultimately is going to run the business, and managing those expectations, understanding the needs of the business as well as the family is going to be critical here, and having that conversation along the way, that it doesn't just become a decision, but it's a discussion. It's critical.
Absolutely. So funny you should mention who should run the business, because that's what we're going to talk about here. So really in the sibling generations for one of the first times, we have options. We've got options between siblings, but also with a non-family leader. Many family businesses at this stage can and start to look towards a non-family business leader rather than choosing amongst a team of siblings. They have one client right now that's 2 sisters and a brother, and they actually decided to hire a non-family CEO. All of the siblings are still involved in management and executive positions, but they've decided it's best for their family business to have a non-family member actually run the business.
Yeah.
So if we do decide to keep leadership though within the family, and we can flip to the next slide, please. How do we develop them into a successful successor? So these conversations here are questions that I asked of my parents when I was taking over leadership of my family business, but have also come up several times through my client work. So some of the best practices for leadership as we transition into the sibling generation is to not make it an obligation to join the business. Have it be a choice so that we don't start to build resentment immediately. We also, it's important to gain some outside experience if that's realistic. sometimes it's just not realistic, but if at all possible, have the next generation work elsewhere to gain exposure to other businesses and gain other opportunities. And oftentimes they can learn so much working for somebody else that how often have you told your kids something and 100 times over, they hear it one other place and come home and they're like, Mom, guess what I learned today? Great, I've told you that over and over and over. So working somewhere else can provide them some learning opportunities that they may not get or may be getting within their own family business.
Yeah.
Also give them some goals, but also make sure, as we talked about in the first section, make sure there's some objective feedback. They need the room to make their own mistakes and learn from those mistakes. Also, increase responsibility for this next generation of leaders step by step as they're moving into successive positions. Let them take on a little bit more as they're moving up within the organization.
Yep.
And David mentioned mentorship earlier. This could either be within the organization, within the family or the company, or outside. They just need to have that resource, that backboard to go to for support.
Yeah.
So then on the flip side, what does the next generation need to do to show that they are a capable leader? They need to take initiative. They need to show their passion that this is something they care about and something that they're in it for the long haul. They need to push to take on more responsibility while keeping the current generation or their parents informed, and which is key in the sibling generation, as we talked about very early on with the 3 circles. This is where they need to begin to separate the business issues from the family issues, particularly amongst sibling teams. This is where things can get heated. So if we start to pull apart that model, the next generation needs to be skilled in separating business ownership and family issues.
Yep.